Today we will talk about how do you communicate risk, public communication of risk in the 21st century. What are the challenges associated with it, and how can we capitalize on the promises of new technologies that are available to us in communicating risk successfully. I want to start with the illustration, the photograph on this slide, which illustrates the challenge we face in communicating risk and how people receive risk information, weigh different risk factors differently. So here is Melissa Williamson, 35, a Bullitt Avenue resident who is worried about the sound of jackhammers on her unborn child. Of course, as you can see, she is also smoking. It is interesting how, in her view or in her mind, one risk factor, the sound of jackhammers, overweights or outweighs the other one, which is smoking and its impact on her unborn child. So what is risk communication? It has a number of definitions with a variety of organizations offering very different definitions. But in essence, what it is an interactive process of exchange of information and opinion among individuals, groups, and institutions, where you discuss different types and levels and methods of managing risk. And so that it involves decisions, actions, or policies aimed at either managing or controlling health or environmental risks. In essence, what it is saying is it is a product of exchange of information among different entities or groups. And this information pertains to how you receive risk information and manage it to facilitate action. The question then is, why study risk communication? In many ways, risk communication is unique because it actually marries theory with application, or theory and practice. Both individual and social contextual factors or environmental factors influence how risk information is generated and received and acted upon. As we said earlier, in the earlier slide, it is a product of interaction among agencies, activist groups, and individuals. And depending on how risk is framed and communicated, the consequences could be profound. Here, I want to introduce a few different terms which will be very helpful, as you may come across these terms in different places in the risk communication literature. One of them is the so-called non-persuasive communications. In this kind of communication, you are not trying to change your audience's beliefs or attitudes or even behavior. What you're trying to do is just to provide information, provide different options to them. So suppose someone is diagnosed with cancer, he or she may have different options for treatment. Option A has certain benefits as well as certain costs. Option B also has certain benefits and certain costs. So in this case, all you're trying to do is give them information on these different options with the assumption that they will make a decision that best fits their situation. That is non-persuasive. On the other hand, when you are doing persuasive communications, you are trying to change people's behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. And in this case, you try to understand people's current values and beliefs and try to construct a message that will address those values and beliefs. That is in persuasive communications. Both forms of communication can talk about outcomes, either negative or positive, that is risks or costs, and sometimes these outcomes are uncertain because we do not know what will happen, or the outcomes could be certain, and it varies from situation to situation and person to person. And you have to, this kind of communication will allow a recipient to weigh both the costs, the risks, the benefits, and make a decision appropriately. What are the different issues one might want to take into consideration when communicating risk? One, you have to take into account the literacy and the numeracy levels of your intended target audience or recipients of your risk communications. As we all know, not everyone is comfortable with quantitative information or with numbers. Risk communication, after all, deals with probabilities. We often say, if you do not take action A, there is a greater likelihood of outcome X. This notion of greater likelihood of something happening, negative or positive, makes it very difficult for people to understand and appreciate as it deals with probabilities. Particularly when you use quantitative terms. When you say something like, if you do action A, you are 8 times likely to feel B or C or D. That kind of quantitative information is difficult for most people. Similarly, literacy levels of the target audience matter. Technical terms, complex terms are not easily understandable. A second thing to take into consideration is try to think about what is it you want to communicate. That is, what is the content? What are the 1 or 2 or 3 facts you want to communicate? Be realistic. You cannot tell your audience member everything you know about that subject or topic. You have to prioritize what are the 2 or 3 things you want your audience member to walk away with. Third, many audiences are not tabula rasa. They have their own beliefs. They are not empty vessels. They come to the message. They come to you with preconceived beliefs and ideas. You have to understand and assess those beliefs before you communicate. And your communication may sometimes reinforce those beliefs or change them. So for example, if an audience member comes to you with a preconceived belief, convinced, say for example, if she or he is convinced that vaccination has immense benefits in reducing infections or protecting them from contracting infections in the first place, you want to reinforce that belief. On the other hand, they may come to you with a preconceived belief that vaccines lead to undesirable outcomes. Then you want to change those beliefs. But you have to know in advance what is their current belief structure so that you can design your communications appropriately. We also want to provide information that facilitates action. Sometimes when we communicate risk, we might generate certain emotions, particularly make it frustrating to the audience if we don't tell them on how to address those risks or mitigate those risks. So it is helpful to have communications that will help them take appropriate action. Lastly, we can take advantage of the communications technologies to calibrate our communications appropriately to the given situation, audience, or condition. In the next few slides, I want to talk about how a message could be constructed. In much risk communication, we do know what to say. Based on science and research and experience, we generally know what facts to communicate. But facts by themselves are boring for many people. So to attract their attention and enhance their attention as well as reception to the messages, you might want to think about how to construct a message. Because from research we know that certain features of the messages, such as format or structure and construction, interact with individuals' background, allowing them to process the information and change knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. It is also important how to understand risk is constructed. And what we mean by construction is that despite our own inclination as scientists to talk about population and talk about facts and how science drives our communication, but in actuality this information is received, as I said earlier, in the context of what else is happening within that system. So when we talk about risk, the risk are facts. Those facts are interpreted or even misinterpreted depending upon how different population groups and institutions interact with each other. Vaccines are a great example, and autism is a great example. Even though there is well-established scientific consensus that vaccination does not lead to autism, but among certain groups, that information may be misinterpreted to suggest that it is still an open question. And so this contestation between two groups, pro and anti-vaccine, will lead to a particular construction of risks. So the point here is that risk information is just not facts. It is a construction of multiple interpretations by multiple agencies and groups in the system. And therefore, the effects of that communication of risk are likely to be influenced by how that information is interpreted by the social groups and the context in which the interpretation is taking place. For example, take a look at the illustration or advertisement on this slide. This advertisement is an attempt by the Japanese government to explain changes in pensions or social security policies for seniors. So here is an exchange that is ostensibly captured between a government official and a senior citizen. But if you think about it, how is this message constructed? It doesn't really matter whether you know the language or not. Just look at how the text is organized, where the photographs are placed, where in the photographs they are looking at each other or away from each other. This clearly suggests a more confrontational approach, or this could potentially suggest a confrontational approach, given that these two people are separated by a text, and they are not even looking at each other. And in fact, their faces are truncated, edging away from the picture into the borders and disappearing off the picture. This might communicate to the intended audience a gulf between the government spokesperson who is trying to explain and the recipient, the senior citizen, and could potentially work against appreciation and understanding of the change. So there are a variety of these formats. Some of them you are familiar with: fear appeals, sensation seeking, narratives or stories, exemplars, or framing. Unfortunately, we do not have time to go into each of these types, but suffice it to say, each of these message formats will be appealing or is appealing to different kinds of audiences. So you have to assess where your audience is and what are their backgrounds before you select a particular format. Sensation seeking, for example, is generally used with youth when you are communicating information to youth. Narratives or stories are widely used because in every culture, stories are an interesting and entertaining way to teach people about useful information, whether health or risk or environment. Whenever we talk about risk information, the receipt of the information, that is, the audience members are receiving this information in a particular context. These are, we do not consider audience members as empty vessels, in the sense that we just accept whatever we provide them. In fact, and on the contrary, the social context in which this information is received has a lot of influence on how that information is received as well as acted on. And some of the factors that potentially influence the receipt of the information include social norms, what kind of norms are extant in that group. So if smoking is widely accepted in that particular group, then any information counter to tobacco use will be influenced by what people in that group think about smoking. There are also issues like patterns of social control. This may sound like an abstruse concept, but what it essentially means is that much of what is accepted as a threat and acted on depends upon what is acceptable within the group or the context in which it is received. If the entire group or the group in the context of the group is against vaccination or against physical activity or pro-tobacco use, then any risk information providing information on threats and facilitating action is unlikely to have an impact. On the other hand, if the general norms are supportive of action to promote health, then the social control aspects of it make the information much more receptive among the audience. The action that people take on the information they are receiving depends upon whether they have an opportunity to act on it or not. So, for example, if you promote vaccination, message on vaccination could be acted on, but only if the vaccines are available. A recent example is the H1N1 pandemic, when the overwhelming information in the media and in public health groups promoted and encouraged people to go out and get vaccinated. But the initial shortage of vaccines has led or discouraged many people, and many of them have decided not to act on the information. So anytime we communicate risk information, we have to make sure that the system allows them to act on that information. And last, people receive this information in the context of everything else that is going on in their lives. If we promote vaccination against pandemics, but if they are stressed about life based on issues such as poverty or joblessness or hopelessness, other kinds of stress or stressors, then it is unlikely that they will act on our information. So we need to take the larger context into account as we promote a particular kind of action in mitigating risk among social groups. Social organizations and institutions play a very important role in generating and constructing risk. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for example, is an institution that generates a lot of information on risk and communicates that information, whether it is on vaccination or infections or chronic diseases. CDC plays an important role in generating that information. On the other hand, advocacy groups may either react to that information or generate their own information. For example, there are a number of vaccine critical groups or groups that are critical of vaccination and who are concerned that vaccinations may have undesirable effects. And they may try to create outrage to influence public opinion about risks of vaccination. In the 21st century, we have two challenges in communicating risk. One, there is an increasing proliferation of platforms and a deluge of information. Second, inequalities in communication. In addition to generating data, people receive this information from a variety of platforms. At one time, we could have communicated risk through mass media such as newspapers or television or radio, or through interpersonal sources such as doctors or healthcare workers. But that is not necessarily the case anymore. People not only have different platforms and devices such as a laptop or a cell phone or a tablet. Sometimes people have multiple platforms. They may own a laptop and a smartphone and a tablet, and they may be receiving information on all three of these devices. And this has allowed people to access information that is of interest to them and relevance to them from these different platforms. So, while providing a great deal of flexibility, it is also fragmenting the audience because they are now attending to different media in very different ways. And then we have social media. Social media includes a variety of user-generated content, such as collaborative projects like Wikipedia, blogs and microblogs like Twitter, content communities like your YouTube, and of course the social networking sites like Facebook, game virtual worlds, game or social worlds such as Second Life or World of War. A second challenge in communicating risk in the 21st century is inequalities in communication across different social groups. By communication inequality, we mean differences among social classes in the generation, manipulation, and distribution of information at a group level, and differences in access to and ability or capacity to take advantage of the information at the individual level. Social class, for example, has an important influence on how people receive information, how people understand quantitative information, how much they can understand facts and maintain accuracy, and how much they learn, and how that knowledge can influence their decision making. Let me explain this with greater specificity. We are particularly interested in 5 types of health communication factors that could influence risk communications, or that constitute a part of risk communication. How people use or access different media to get information, or how they are exposed to information when they are watching or using certain media. How much attention do they pay to this information? Or do they go out and actively seek information? How do they process information? And what are the consequences of this? Here is one example of what we mean by access. Many people are on internet. Almost 70 to 80% of American households have access to the internet. But here is an interesting chart which clearly demonstrates that access to broadband internet is largely influenced by race, education, and geography, whether you are in the urban areas or rural areas. Invariably, those who are in urban areas have greater access to broadband internet compared to people in the rural areas. People with college degree have higher access compared to people with less than high school diploma. There are also some variations across different race and ethnic groups. This is a way to demonstrate that access and use of media is a very critical factor in how people receive risk information. Risk information often involves communicating quantitative information. As you can clearly see here, not everybody is comfortable with quantitative information. Here is an example where people with higher income are more comfortable compared to people with a lower income. Clearly here, people who make $20,000 or less per year are more likely to say that they have difficulty understanding medical statistics compared to people who make more than $75,000 a year. So, what do we understand and what can we conclude about communicating risk? One, let us assess the needs of your audience before you begin your strategic communication efforts. 2, always plan to evaluate your risk information outreach. Your evaluation plan need not be complex, time-consuming, or expensive. Simple markers of successful efforts are sufficient. Pay close attention to how the message is constructed. As I said, it is not just the facts, but how the facts are arranged together that matters when it comes to successful communication. Be aware of how emotions matter. Risk communications could lead to or generate emotions which can interfere with information processing. So you might want to take into account how you might engender these emotions and how you can address them. The context in which this information is generated and received matters, such as when different institutions put out risk information together that could either agree with each other or conflict with each other. Last, social determinants such as race or ethnicity, social class, geography, etc. influence how information is received and acted on.